Okay, Chapter 21. Starting the next unit, this is all about U.S. expansion, the U.S. becoming a colonial power. Some of the reasons the U.S. started to expand, U.S. expansion shifts after 1890. They see a combination of earlier patterns from settlement. They want to look for more points from military and trading. They pretty much completed transcontinental expansion, mostly intended for settlement and agriculture. And now they're looking at taking new strategically placed islands, intending them as colonies, new territories for naval bases, trading outposts, commercial centers along those trading routes. Some will support expansion for military purposes, others for their own purposes to demonstrate the nation's strength. Some of them for limiting U.S. or foreign influence. 1870s, they started new interests beyond U.S. boundaries. U.S. policy at this point had been centered around expanding west, protecting U.S. interests, limiting foreign influence. Ever since George Washington's farewell address, we're really not getting that involved. Now, post-Civil War industry boom seems... Okay, I have to backtrack. I can't remember where I was. Somebody came in. U.S. boundaries, limiting foreign influence. Post-Civil War industry boom saw a shift in U.S. relations to the rest of the world, a growing sense of internationalism. Expansion would bring in more markets, give guidance to native people everywhere, and that was one of the things that theories on expansion, Darwin's social theory, the biogenetic law, international Darwinism, basically thinking that the Anglo-Saxon race is seen as superior and therefore its influence should be spread around the world. Josiah Strong took that into more religious aspect when he wrote Our Country. It became very popular, increased the call for imperialism for Christian reasons. He was a minister and expansionist and called for foreign missions to civilize the world under Anglo-Saxon races, expansion for trade, Christian religion. Americans should civilize countries around the world. And it's really the first time that they felt a need for foreign policy, even with the frontier thesis and the expansion and everything else. Secretaries of State Seward, Fish, Blaine, Olney, all of them working together kind of foster this idea of empire and influence. So the foreign policy to begin with was the Monroe Doctrine, basically no European influence in the Western Hemisphere. That was what had been our lasting influence. William Seward comes in. He pushed an expansionist policy, had a vision of the U.S. empire going into Latin America, western shores of Asia, Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean islands, Hawaii. He's going to push for Alaska. That was one of his first acquisitions, that and the Midway Islands, which are about 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii. But Russia had established a small colony for seal hunting and always had this threat of Great Britain taking over, and so they decide to sell. Seward wants to buy Alaska. So 1867 buys it for $7.2 million, and people make fun of him. It's seen as Seward's folly, Seward's ice box, because he bought this huge amount of land in what they considered the frozen north and basically said, it was a really bad decision. Didn't realize that there was later going to be a lot of natural resources that were going to make it much more valuable. In Latin America, we're trying to get rid of European influence, starting out with the Pan American Conference, 1889. Delegates from 19 American nations negotiate agreements to promote trade, presided over by the Secretary of State Blaine at that point. We also support Venezuela against Great Britain. They had a boundary dispute between Venezuela and the British colony, and basically said, British Prime Minister said it's not U.S. business. We argue the Monroe Doctrine, ready to back up with military force. British agrees, sees more benefits long term to cultivate this friendship, but is starting to see this as a turning point in U.S.-Great Britain relations, and it's a lot more tense than it had been. In Hawaii, we had, at this point going into all the Hawaiian affairs, the McKinley Tariff Act was negotiated. It's put some financial strain on Hawaii because of the increased rates. We also had the McKinley Tariff Act with Latin American countries, flour, grain, meat, iron, machinery, all of that part of it. But we start to work towards reciprocity or mutual benefits, mutual exchange and privileges towards each country. And so we're trying to do the same thing in Hawaii. McKinley Tariff, like I said, had caused a lot of hardship. They're working towards getting free sugar imports from Hawaii. There's a lot of American fruit and sugar companies on the island. U.S. had already pretty much considered an unofficial part of the United States. And Hawaii was considered the crossroads of the Pacific. And we established a reciprocity treaty to allow for Hawaiian sugar to enter the U.S. tax-free if the Hawaiian monarchy made no concessions to other powers. Basically just establishing a relationship of trade between the two. It increased economic dependence on the U.S., made essentially an American protectorate, and a lot of benefits, especially to the white Hawaiians. You do have some financial hardship in other places, but you do have still quite a bit of strain between the native Hawaiians and the Americans that are starting to settle there. Queen Liliuokalani retaliates for the McKinley Tariff, tries to reduce the U.S. influence when she comes to power after the king dies. And so the solution was to increase the hostilities. America wanted to go ahead and get Hawaii for good, just to avoid any further conflict and to keep trade up. So they basically stage a coup. Queen surrenders to quote-unquote superior power in the bloodless revolution. And the U.S. is made a Hawaii is made a U.S. possession. 1898. President Cleveland didn't like the way it was handled, stopped the annexation, but it would take another 5 years, annexed by McKinley later on. A lot of Hawaiian missionaries. The churches were built in the late 1820s, decades before the war. A lot of missionaries had settled there prior to U.S. going in for business reasons. All right, part of becoming a new world power and part of this whole imperialism expansion, there was a naval strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who said, you know what, overseas markets are essential for the country's ambition, and his writing, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, supported building a larger navy. 1883, we only had 4 steel ships. Gets with the Secretary of Navy, Benjamin Tracy, to supervise a program of naval construction, push for steel-clad ships with rapid-fire guns, modern torpedoes, and just kind of some of the numbers. By 1880, we had less than 2,000 ships, only 48 of which could fire a gun. And the new class of naval officers and building up the program, by 1885 to 1889, they budget for 30 more ships, and we gained the offensive capability at sea. 1889, the U.S. was the 12th ranked navy in the world. 4 years later, 1893, they were the 7th ranked among the world navies. Now they're first. But by building and making an emphasis on having new and modern ships, it increased their offensive capability and status as a world power. All right, moving towards war. The Cuban Rebellion. Cuban insurgents were rebelling against Spanish rule. 1895, wasted plantations, taxes, basically burning everything in sight, burning their plantations against the insurrections. So they're having a lot of problems. Cubans in New York were raising money to help Cuban independence, and to kind of capitalize on all the problems in the world affairs, yellow journalism, basically writing to persuade U.S. sentiment or public sentiment in favor of Cuban independence, especially after the Weyler's reconcentration policy to move native population into camps and destroy the spirit of rebellion, using the images from those concentration camps, internment camps, to persuade opinions. William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, painted lands as exotic and adventurous, and then captured and being destroyed by Spanish control, Cubans dying by the thousands from overcrowding, disease, sanitation, all of that, painting the picture of it to get people to support the Cuban insurgents. President McKinley gained some Spanish concessions, says the new government in Madrid, gives amnesty to political prisoners, released Americans, recalls Weyler. U.S. at this point, though, sentiment is not going to be completely amicable towards the Spanish, especially after the interception of the Delome letter. Delome letter was a letter from the Spanish ambassador, and in it he calls McKinley weak, a wannabe politician, and really gets U.S. sentiment against the Spanish. Pair that with the explosion of the Maine. McKinley had ordered the Maine, a ship, to Havana to protect America if necessary. Delome letter was published criticizing the president. People blame Spain, get a lot of anti-Spanish sentiment going, and then when the Maine explodes, people blame the Spanish for the explosion, and that just propels U.S. sentiment again towards war with Spain. April 19th, Congress will declare Cuba independent, passes the Teller Amendment, McKinley giving Spain final terms after Congress will also give $50 million and authorize military use to get rid of Spain from Cuba. Teller Amendment also pledges no annexation of the island, even when they get their independence, to guarantee their interest. April 25th, U.S. declares war on Spain, so just a few days later, after Spain had severed diplomatic relations. Theodore Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, also criticized McKinley, but he will quit his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and go and join or form the Rough Riders, of volunteer cavalry, to fight during the Spanish-American War. People using the Maine as a rally point. All right, the war itself, now that war had been declared. Oh, a couple slides ago, let me go back. I forgot to address one. This one, yellow journalism and jingoism. Jingoism is a good one to know, good vocabulary word, meaning extreme patriotism in the form of aggressive foreign policy, using bias in judging one's own country as superior to others, calling for an aggressive policy, all of that tied with the journalism itself to persuade public opinion. All right, so the war itself, known as the Splendid Little War, U.S. was not very well prepared for this. Did not have enough officers, did not have enough supplies, problems with equipment and supplies. A lot of it showing a lot of the inefficiencies in the War Department itself. However, even though the War Department fell behind, U.S. was still successful in its endeavors, and the war only lasted 10 weeks. The course of the war, the military strategy was to destroy the Spanish fleet first and foremost, to damage Spain's merchant marine. Commodore Dewey will capture Manila Bay with more modern ships, better guns, first shots of the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, crushes the Spanish fleet, accepts the surrender of Manila and the Philippines. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, success at San Juan Hill. Philippines will surrender. Cuba was invaded, faced no opposition at Guantanamo Bay, pushed on to Santiago. And with Dewey positioned in Hong Kong, everything leading to the end of the war, finalized with the Treaty of Paris, 1898. Cuba was made independent. U.S. will take on Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The U.S. defended their position of taking the Philippines as they had to keep them instead of giving back to Spain or letting somebody else take them over. They said they weren't ready for the task of being independent. Independence was sorted by people saying they weren't ready. Very racist portrayal and perception of the country. U.S. was now considered a colonizing nation. There was a lot of fighting between the Americans and Filipinos over the control of the Filipinos, and that's going to lead us into the Philippine-American War. American Anti-Imperialist League was those opposing to the policy that had to do with the Philippines. All right, guerrilla warfare was a big problem in the Philippines. Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, all those against it. Andrew Carnegie even offered to give $20 million and just buy the Philippine independence, but that was denied. And so with this, you have many people believing it's a violation of the Declaration of Independence by depriving the Filipinos of their right to life, liberty, and happiness. The fighting that happens in the Philippines, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who had actually helped, was actually the organizer of the anti-Spanish resistance and helped the Americans to claim independence then, now turns around, uses guerrilla tactics, striking suddenly, then melting into the jungle. Americans will, eventually take him prisoner. He agrees to stop the fighting. U.S. will replace the military with civil rule, setting up a local government system, establishing, infrastructure for independence with the Taft Commission, with schools, roads, bridges, restructured tax system, sanitation, all of that to make the Philippines ready for independence. All right. Within all of that, Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, organizing its territories that were made U.S. Citizens. Navy will control Guam. Cuban Constitution ends the U.S. occupation, so they're on their own. And the Platt Amendment giving the U.S. right to intervene in Cuban affairs, even though they do have their own independence. But the question at this point is, does the citizenship follow the flag? And here they've decided a few places where it does and does not. In Puerto Rico, they actually reversed their decision with the Foraker Act, decides they're going to be citizens of Puerto Rico, not of the United States. It becomes an unincorporated territory. And with the insular cases, a series of court cases where it said constitutional rights were not automatically extended, but Congress would decide them on an individual basis. Congress has the power to decide them. It's island cases, and I will pick up with the last little bit next.